You're watching Reality Check. Whatever remaining doubts over the Taliban's claims of having changed for the better evaporated after the extremist group announced its much-delayed new government for Afghanistan. As it turned out, a collection of globally wanted terrorists, Al-Qaeda allies and drug barons, starting all the way to the top. The Prime Minister, Mullah Hassan Akhund, is on a UN global terror list. A US diplomatic cable that was leaked said he is one of the most ineffective and unreasonable of Taliban leaders, subject to mood swings and is difficult to work with. He holds prejudices against both Westerners and Mujahideen. He sanctioned the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001. Now, despite all of this, he actually edged out a quote-unquote relatively more moderate Taliban leader, Mullah Baradar, for the top job. Akhund is said to be close to the late Mullah Omar, the founder of the Taliban, and he, like Omar, was born in Kandahar, the Taliban bastion. The Interior Minister in charge of security and the biggest gainer in all this is Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's on this FBI wanted list, a poster of which has gone viral since. He's been behind the bombings of the Indian embassy. Pakistan's hand is supposed to be behind his entry into the Taliban cabinet. He's said to maintain close ties with Al-Qaeda. His base is eastern Afghanistan on the Pakistan border, and he may have the powers to also appoint provincial governors, which is why everyone is calling him the biggest winner of this churn. The refugee minister is his uncle, Khalil Haqqani, also on the US UN global terror list, also of the Haqqani terror network. The Deputy Prime Minister, Mullah Baradar, is also on a UN global terror list. The New York Times described him as a brutal commander on the battlefield. He was arrested, released finally under US pressure, from where he began a political outreach based in Doha, Qatar. The Deputy Prime Minister, Mullah Abdul Hanafi, is also on a UN sanctions list. He is allegedly involved in drug trafficking during Taliban 1.0. The Defense Minister, Mullah Yaqub Mujahid, is not on any terror list, but he is the son of the Taliban's emir, the late Mullah Omar. And Mullah Yaqub is currently the head of all Taliban's military operations in 2020. The intelligence chief, Abdul Haq Wasiq, is a former Guantanamo Bay prisoner, released in exchange for a US prisoner of war. The New York Times says his interrogation files too point to close ties to Al-Qaeda. The Deputy of Intelligence, Mullah Taj Mir Jawad, is allegedly a member of the Haqqani network. He is believed to have been the head of suicide attacks that crippled Kabul, said to have lived in Peshawar under the ISI support. The Taliban also appears to have brought back something called the Ministry of Proselytizing and Preaching, headed by a Sheikh Khalid, which is raising fears whether this is a return to the horrific days of the Taliban's religious police that used to drive around Kabul and surround and beat up people who it believed was not following its strict Islamic code. Of course, no women and no members of Afghanistan's earlier regime, and almost all those in the ministry are Pashtuns, the tribe to which the Taliban mostly belongs. Now, what does it mean for all these men who are on a UN sanction list and now are part of a government? There's a freeze on traveling and transiting through other countries if you're on a UN terror list. There's a freeze on assets and economic resources. There's a freeze on sale and transfer to other countries. Now, undeterred by all this, the women of Afghanistan took to the streets for the second day in a row, marching and protesting and demanding their hard-fought rights. The media got a taste of the so-called new Taliban. What we're going to play you are videos and images of journalists for the media outlet Ehtiyat Rose out covering the protests. They were seen limping out of Taliban custody after being arrested by the Taliban. Some of them, in these images shared, appear to have been lashed severely, all simply, it would seem, for covering these protests. Let me go to panel. Let me start with Syed Akbaruddin, India's former ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Akbaruddin, for joining us. I just first want to understand from you, from a perspective of the UN, that you have the UN-sanctioned list of terrorists and terrorist-linked individuals. What happens in this sort of situation, Mr. Akbaruddin, when so many of these individuals have now effectively become part of a government?
So before I start, I'd just like to congratulate you and NDTV. I understand today is your founding day,
Thank
33
you. Yes,
years of a journey, and I wish you all the best for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that said, the situation that the United Nations is facing is an extremely unusual one. It's one in which a non-state entity was designated as a terror organization and a threat to international peace and security, while it was a non-state entity. Today, that non-state group or entity and the individuals associated with it have captured state power. Now, this is an unusual occurrence because the United Nations treats terrorism not as a phenomenon of states. It sees terrorists as non-state entities. But here you have a non-state entity grabbing state power, and therefore they are unable to comprehend how to go about the next steps.
Okay,
obviously,
so, yes, keep going, sir.
Obviously, just a minute. Obviously, they will have to recalibrate this in taking into account a whole host of factors. And when there is a mix in international diplomacy, it means a conflict of interest, a convergence of interest. So you will have much of this pulls, to's and fro's before we come to a solution.
So in simple terms, just to explain to the ordinary viewer, the fact that you have a prime minister of a country who's on the UN global terror list, someone like Siraj Haqqani who's on multiple terror lists, what happens to them? Does this mean that can they travel to other countries? Can they trade, or are they now exempt? Will they not face justice? What happens?
So the UN designation list is not about justice. It's a preventive measure to try and control terrorists from moving around states and to try and control them from gaining financial support as well as arms and ammunition. Those measures have obviously failed. It's a breakdown of that regime.
But
now have to
but these
afresh.
Gentlemen, so it may have failed to at least prevent them from capturing power. But now that they've captured power, will these gentlemen still come under the ambit of the list? In other words, can they travel to other countries and whatnot?
No. Until there is a legal change in the regime, those stipulations stay. However, now that the ground realities has changed, there will obviously an effort to try and see how best to recalibrate it. Now, there are various ways to recalibrate it, either to continue this process or to have a more omnibus resolution which supersedes this and imposes sanctions on a state itself. Those are other options that are available. But for now, those options that are in place stay in place.
How worried are you, and how worried should India be?
So, from an Indian perspective, terrorism has been one of the cardinal features of our foreign policy even before 9/11. Let's not forget Taliban and the Kandahar hijack. India was a victim of this even prior to 9/11. For 20 years or more than 20 years, we've made this an important pillar of our foreign policy. That said, the ground realities have changed, and everybody has to take into account those ground realities. For a country like India, it's more difficult because we have been wedded to a concept. Our public opinion is sensitized to a concept. So it will take much more of a effort to try and calibrate to the new ground realities.
In simple terms, because I know you're a seasoned diplomat, but in simple terms, India is already officially talking to the Taliban. We know this. But this is, again, before this government was announced. Now you have people like Siraj Haqqani as Interior Minister and so on. I won't repeat what I just read out. Should we still be trying to talk to them?
So, Vasu, there are multiple levels of talking. One is an operational engagement. Operational engagement means at the ground level. We still have people there in Afghanistan who perhaps are Indian citizens or people of Indian origin who may want to come back. We have other interests. So there is no harm in having an operational level engagement to provide consular and other services to those Indian nationals. However, this does not mean automatically we recognize that state. That is going to be a much more difficult task. It is a diplomatic engagement that will take months perhaps before we move down that path fully. It will involve give and take. It will involve, after all, diplomacy is all about negotiation and bargaining. The only way diplomats can work is through give and take.
Fair enough. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Akbaruddin, for joining us. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
All right, let me go across to panel. We have with us Major Andrew Fox, retired, who was part of the British Army, served 3 tours of Afghanistan. Is with us Omar Altaf, senior journalist based in Islamabad, is with us. But let me start with Rizaul Hassan Laskar, foreign editor, Hindustan Times, who's been tracking the story closely. I beg your pardon. Lisa Curtis is also with us, director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Good to have you as always. Let me start with Rizaul Hassan Laskar. Raza, the state of affairs is such, the kind of people who've been appointed in this government that are so, I don't know, quote unquote wanted, have such a terrible track record that some of them have still not surfaced. There's still no sign of Siraj Haqqani. There's still no sign of Mullah Yaqub, Mullah Omar's son. It's that bad.
Well, you know, I mean, if anyone had been following this story for the last few weeks, you know, we had been picking up these signs that there were divisions between the different factions. You had the more sort of so-called moderate people like Baradar and, you know, from the political side. And there was this huge pull from the guys like the Haqqanis who had done the actual fighting and wanted to have a greater share.
Right.
Now, what I am picking up from sources is that Mullah Akhund is kind of a compromise between these two groups. He's a guy who was very
Mullah
close
Akhund
to
is the
Mullah
Prime
Omar.
Minister, yes, active or interim Prime Minister, yes.
Mullah Akhund, and, you know, and what I was told is that, you know, if anyone suggested Mullah Akhund's name, even though he's been out in the cold for a long time, he was somebody nobody would say no to. You have to also look at a couple of other factors. You know, this is a really cliched thing for an Indian to be saying, but, you know, the government was announced just 3 days after the Pakistani spy chiefs surfaced
of course.
in a hotel lobby.
But Reza, I just want to ask you one thing though, and we'll come to Pakistan in a second, but my original question, do you think that these people will now have to surface? Will Siraj Haqqani, who I don't think has been seen in public for months, if not years, is he going to emerge now and sit in a government office?
He's going to emerge. I mean, no, I don't think we're going to see more of these guys. I think what we are going to see is, what I'm hearing is that even Akhund is not going to be seen much. He's going to be probably based out of Kandahar. Most of the work will be done by the 2 deputy prime ministers. And I think Yaqub and Sirajuddin Haqqani have very clear instructions to focus on the domestic security, the defense, and all the military sort of stuff. I don't think we are going to see much of these guys coming out and making public statements.
Right. Major Andrew Fox, as someone who's served in Afghanistan, what are your thoughts as you watch many of these men who, you know, are globally designated terrorists, probably people that were being fought by the NATO coalition forces, now sitting or basically appointed to high office?
It's the final culmination of the sort of the international humiliation of the West that President Biden has overseen over the last month or so. They started in 2001 to depose the Taliban. They spent trillions of dollars, and now they've left 20 years later with not only the Taliban still in charge, but a strengthened Taliban that has strong Al-Qaeda links still, but also with further terrorist groups operating within Afghanistan's borders. So this really does just drill home, I think, the staggering failure of diplomacy and foreign affairs that President Biden has overseen.
And your personal sort of reaction to these names?
I feel defeated, frankly. These are the people that I and my colleagues were fighting for 20 years, and they won, quite simply. We didn't lose a firefight. We didn't lose a tactical engagement.
Sure.
But it's been so utterly mismanaged at the political level that it feels very much like we are defeated and they are victorious.
Okay. Omar Altaf, we had you on last time. You were very vehement that Pakistan had nothing to do with the Taliban, was not involved in any of this. Would you still say that after what we saw, the ISI chief flying in? The government announced after that the Haqqani network, who many believe are closely linked to the ISI, getting a prominent role?
I think most of the leaders who have been appointed by Taliban this time around also had some role in the previous dispensation as well, most of them. So obviously they have links to Pakistan, but it's not that Pakistan has installed a government. Taliban took over, and now Taliban has started negotiations with a lot of countries. I think these talks, such as ISI chief visiting Kabul on the invitation of Taliban, I think you're going to see more of this. Maybe the spy chiefs and of other countries, maybe Russia's, China's, and Iran may visit, and even maybe India also
of course
established some links with Taliban.
Omar, the difference is that it's not like other countries, because the view is that Pakistan has provided sanctuary to these terrorists, and this is from where they recovered, they retreated, and they carried out attacks. And if you see that as also a sentiment on the streets of Kabul, almost every protest is chanting, get out Pakistan. We don't want a Pakistan-controlled regime.
Absolutely, there may be this sentiment, but like the Afghan army capitulated. The Taliban may not be popular, but there is unfortunately or fortunately no military resistance to Taliban now. So I think people of Afghanistan would have to contend with Taliban for a very long time until something extraordinary happens. Now that the Afghan forces have melted and they have also captured Panjshir and the resistance has fallen.
Right.
And as far as the role of...
Yes. Lisa Curtis, again we come back to this, that it's one thing to roll our eyes and get all outraged when we see the parade of all these different, jihadist figures now join government. But again, with Pakistan, I mean, how would they be able to even be in these positions without Pakistan? And yet, Pakistan has, there's no consequences.
Well, I want to completely agree with Major Andrew Fox and everything that he said. He completely nailed it in terms of this shows a failure of the United States diplomatic political strategy, the complete failure of the Doha Agreement and the peace process, because what we have here is an interim government filled with hardliners, filled with terrorists who have the blood of Americans on their hands. It's really, almost a thumbing of the nose by Pakistan, by the Taliban at the United States. So we really couldn't have imagined a worse interim Taliban government. And, for so long, we had the U.S. negotiator telling us there was going to be a power sharing, an interim government. Even Abdullah Karzai went back to Kabul thinking they would be part of some kind of interim government. And that's absolutely not what has happened. And I think that's right. This does show that Pakistan will have a strong role in this government. The Haqqanis, we heard so often how the Haqqani veritable arm of the ISI. We see the ISI chief there as they're forming the government. So clearly Pakistan will have a big role. And so I think, what we'll start to see is Afghans calling this government a puppet of Pakistan, just like, the Pakistanis and the Taliban had tried to call the Ghani government a puppet of the United States. I think what we see as the Taliban is a puppet of Pakistan.
Right. Raza, in terms of when you talk to officials here, what is the sense you're getting about how worried India is, especially when it sees people like the Haqqanis now, behind carrying out attacks even on the Indian embassy, now in positions of power?
Vasu, if you look at the last few years and the kind of assessments that have been done, and these are public documents, the UN has the 1267 committee reports, the numbers have varied between 6,500. I have picked up about 10,000 Pakistani fighters from groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed.
Right.
These guys are in Afghanistan. Now, these are not, engineers or IT software guys who you could reskill. I mean, these guys know just one thing. They know how to fight. They are terrorists. And, you can't just get these guys and tell them to do something else. So the biggest worry is, yes, we do have no contiguous border. The Kashmir borders are very, very secure. I mean, it's not going to be very easy for them to get across and get into Kashmir.
Right.
But the worry is you have 7,000, 8,000 fighters. These
Right.
guys are going to do something at some point of time.
Okay.
There could be a spillover into some other area.
Major Fox, while there is a general view, especially from the outside, that the Taliban have sort of parasited themselves onto the body politic of Afghanistan, you've fought there. Give us a sense of what exactly is the extent of support they have, because that's something which doesn't come out perhaps enough. And when you look at this government now and you look at the kind of people who've been appointed, maybe it's time to start taking a hard look at those questions.
If you look at the tactics that were adopted, we called them counterinsurgency. And the whole point of a counterinsurgency is to try and persuade the local population in general to favour the government that you are backing rather than perhaps another government. So in this instance, we were trying to persuade the Afghan people to support the Kabul government rather than the Taliban regime. But there were so many mistakes made right at the start. Villages were bombed. There was collateral damage. Families were killed. Civilian casualties were very, very high indeed. And by adopting these tactics, effectively, we failed in our ambition right from the word go, because people didn't see us as friendly liberators. They saw us as just another combatant who was inflicting casualties onto the people.
Right.
And so it's almost impossible to make a comeback and a regain from that. So even though we intensified our efforts to protect the population, and we intensified our efforts to make sure we were only fighting people who needed to be fought, it was far too late by that point. And so in terms of whether they support the Taliban or not, what I got from people in Helmand province was they just wanted to be left alone.
Okay.
And they would favour whichever side just left them in peace to farm their opium and to let their families grow up.
Omar Altaf, every other country has expressed concern over the Taliban takeover, except in the same manner, Pakistan. Imran Khan actually said, the people of Afghanistan have been freed from the shackles of slavery. But shouldn't Pakistan be worried? I mean, Haqqani Network, TTP, these are groups that have carried out strikes inside Pakistan, have targeted school children.
Absolutely, I think Pakistan should be concerned about TTP regaining ground in Pakistan. And over the last week, there has been a suicide attack in Mastung, Balochistan province of Pakistan, where 4 soldiers were killed and 20 injured. And this attack was carried out by Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan.
Right.
But the thing is, if you say that Pakistan has control over Taliban is a puppet of Pakistan. So how does TTP find sanctuaries in Afghanistan? That's a question I have got no answer to.
Okay.
And why wouldn't Taliban hand over TTP militants to Pakistan if they are our proxy?
Okay, well, there's one school of thought believes that actually that benefits Pakistan because it keeps them relevant. It makes it seem that they have an arm's length distance from these groups, while at the same time fostering them. But anyway, let's see how it plays itself out. Deeply worrying at the moment. We're out of time. Thank you all so much for joining me. You've been a great panel. Thank you for watching. Good night.